There is a moment in the grand theater of power when the laughter dies, when the painted smile of the jester cracks, not in despair, but in revelation. Behind the motley and the mockery, behind the pratfalls and the pranks, there lies an intelligence sharp as a dagger, a will coiled like a serpent in the rafters of the court. The jester, long dismissed as a fool, knows something the king does not, that the throne is an illusion, and the crown is only as heavy as the hands that believe in its weight. This is where Machiavelli's shadow creeps into the spotlight. Not the Machiavelli of dry political treatises, but the Machiavelli who understood power as a performance, who saw in the jester's antics the same ruthless calculus that governs kings. For what is a ruler if not a performer who has convinced the world of his right to rule? And what is a jester if not the one who exposes that fragile fiction with a well-timed joke? From Jester to King is not merely a study of political ascent. It is an excavation of the hidden alchemy that turns mockery into mastery, that transforms the fool into the sovereign. Consider the court jester, that paradoxical figure who is both powerless and untouchable. He speaks truths that would cost a nobleman his head, dances along the edge of treason with impunity, and does it all under the guise of entertainment. The jester's immunity is his disguise. His absurdity is his armor. But what happens when the jester tires of laughter? When he realizes that the same mechanisms that allow him to mock the king could, if wielded differently, allow him to become the king. Machiavelli, that cunning observer of human nature, would have recognized the jester's potential immediately. In The Prince, he writes of the necessity of deception, of the strategic use of appearances to manipulate perception. The jester already excels in this art. His entire existence is a carefully constructed deception, a performance of harmlessness that masks his true insight. The transition from jester to king is not a leap, but a pivot, a shift from undermining authority to embodying it. Yet this transformation is not merely about ambition. It is about the nature of power itself. Power does not reside in the crown, nor in the scepter, nor in the edicts of law. Power resides in belief, in the collective agreement that someone has the right to rule. The jester, by his very role, understands this better than anyone. He has spent his life exposing the absurdity of power, revealing its constructed nature. And in that revelation lies the seed of usurpation. If power is a fiction, then why should he not rewrite the story? History whispers of such figures, men and women who rose from the margins of ridicule to the center of command. The Roman Emperor Nero, who played the lyre while Rome burned, was first a spectacle before he was a tyrant. Medieval court fools, through wit and cunning, became trusted advisors, and then, in some cases, the hidden hands behind the throne. Even in modern times, the archetype persists. The comedian who becomes the politician, the satirist who transitions from mocking power to wielding it. The line between jest and dominion is thinner than we admit. But this is not merely a historical curiosity. It is a mirror held up to our own world, where the boundaries between entertainment and authority blur daily. In an age where social media clowns ascend to political influence, where memes shape public opinion more effectively than policy papers, the jester's path to kingship is more relevant than ever. The tools have changed. The court is now digital. The laughter is algorithmically amplified, but the game remains the same. So we begin here, at the intersection of laughter and dominion, where the fool's cap hides a crown in waiting. This is not just a study of power, but of transformation, of how the most underestimated figures in the room can become the most dangerous. The jester does not conquer through force, but through perception. He does not seize the throne. He convinces the world that it was always his. Myths and dreams are the language of the unconscious, and in their labyrinthine symbolism, we find echoes of Jung's brutal truth about powerlessness. Consider the ancient tale of Inanna, the Sumerian goddess who descends into the underworld, stripped of her jewels, her crown, and finally her very flesh, until she stands naked and broken before her dark sister, Ereshkigal. This is no mere story of defeat. It is an allegory of initiation. Inanna's powerlessness is not her end, but her rebirth. She must surrender every layer of her identity to pass through the gates of the underworld. And in that surrender, she discovers a sovereignty far deeper than the superficial power she once wielded. Jung would recognize this journey instantly. The ego, like a nana, must be dismantled before the self can be remade. Then there is the alchemical process of nigredo, the blackening, where base matter is reduced to its primordial state, a chaotic, formless mass that seems devoid of value. To the untrained eye, it is pure destruction. But the alchemists understood it as the necessary first step toward transformation. So too with the psyche. When we are plunged into the nigredo of powerlessness, when relationships crumble, when purpose evaporates, when the body or mind betrays us, we are not being punished. We are being dissolved. The old structures of meaning must decay so that something more resilient can emerge. Jung saw this as a universal pattern. Darkness precedes dawn, chaos births order, and the feeling of being utterly lost is often the prelude to finding a true path. Even nature whispers this truth. The caterpillar's dissolution in the chrysalis is not a graceful metamorphosis but a near-total liquefaction. A cellular unraveling that looks, for all intents and purposes, like death. Yet from this soup of disintegration, wings form. The creature that could only crawl is remade into one that can fly. Here, the symbolism is unmistakable. Powerlessness is not the opposite of transformation. It is its raw material. The ego clings to the safety of the ground, but the soul knows that to become what we are meant to be, we must first endure the terror of the in-between, that liminal space where nothing is certain and everything is possible. These narratives are not escapist fantasies. They are maps. They show us that the anguish of powerlessness has always been part of the human journey, not as a flaw to be remedied, but as a sacred passage. The question is not how to avoid the descent, but how to meet it. Will we rage against the stripping away of our illusions? Or will we, like a nana, let the underworld do its work? Will we see the nigredo as a curse, or as the first stirrings of gold in the alchemist's flask? The symbols are clear. What feels like an ending is often the unseen beginning of a story too vast for the uninitiated to comprehend. To translate Jung's insights from the realm of myth into the pulse of daily existence is to recognize that powerlessness is not some abstract philosophical dilemma. It is the quiet tremor in your hands when faced with a decision you cannot control. The hollow ache of grief that refuses to be rationalized away. The frustration of societal systems that seem designed to remind you of your smallness. The challenge is not to transcend these feelings but to mine them for their hidden potency. Imagine a potter at the wheel. The clay resists, slips, collapses under unskilled hands. Yet the artisan knows that this resistance is not failure. It is dialogue. So too with powerlessness. It is the psyche's way of signaling where we are being called to grow, where our old ways of being no longer serve us. Consider the simple act of setting boundaries, an often misunderstood exercise of power. Many assume that to be powerful is to never need boundaries, to be impervious to the demands of others. But Jung's framework reveals the opposite. True strength emerges when we acknowledge our limits. The person who can say no from a place of self-awareness, rather than guilt or fear, is not contracting their world but expanding it. They are no longer fighting the exhaustion of overextension, no longer pouring from an empty cup. This is powerlessness transformed into agency, not through domination, but through discernment. Similarly, in moments of collective uncertainty, economic instability, political unrest, environmental crises, the Jungian approach does not advocate for blind optimism or passive despair, but for the courage to stand in the tension, to ask, what is this revealing about what we've ignored? What shadows are being forced into the light? Even the rituals of modern life can become vessels for this integration. Therapy, journaling, meditation. These are not mere self-help tools but contemporary forms of alchemy. When you sit with a therapist and articulate a long-buried shame, you are performing your own nigredo, breaking down the leaden weight of silence into something malleable. When you meditate and observe your thoughts without judgment, you are practicing the art of holding the tension between opposites. The very process Jung believed was necessary for psychological growth. And in the mundane, The act of pausing before reacting in anger, of choosing curiosity over defensiveness when criticized, of allowing yourself to rest without guilt. These are the microscopic rebellions against the tyranny of false power. The societal implications run even deeper. In a culture that equates worth with productivity, admitting fragility is revolutionary. Movements that embrace vulnerability, from mental health advocacy to disability justice, are not signs of societal weakness but of collective maturation. They echo Jung's insistence that the way forward is not to deny our shadows but to integrate them. When a community acknowledges its historical wounds instead of burying them, when leaders admit fallibility rather than clinging to the facade of infallibility, they are embodying the very principles that transform powerlessness from a liability into a crucible for change. The systems that fear this vulnerability are the ones that crumble under their own rigidity, while those that adapt, that honor the full spectrum of human experience, are the ones that endure. Beneath the surface of courtly laughter lies a deeper drama, one that plays out not just in palaces but in the very architecture of human consciousness. The jester's journey from mockery to mastery is no mere political strategy. It is an archetypal transformation encoded in our myths, our dreams, and the secret language of power. To understand this metamorphosis, we must look beyond the obvious and into the symbolic realm where masks reveal more than they conceal. Consider the ancient tale of the trickster gods, Loki weaving chaos through Asgard, Anansi spinning webs of deception, Coyote remaking the world through his endless schemes. These figures, like our court jester, operate in the liminal spaces between order and chaos, their apparent foolishness masking profound wisdom. The Norse god Odin himself, the All-Father, often wandered Midgard disguised as a ragged wanderer, gathering knowledge through deception. Here we see the first great paradox. The highest wisdom often wears the cloak of madness. In medieval courts, the jester's traditional bauble mirrored the royal orb, one a toy, the other a symbol of divine right. Yet both were hollow, both filled with nothing but the air of belief that gave them weight. The carnival traditions of Europe reveal another layer of this truth. During the Feast of Fools, hierarchies were temporarily inverted. Peasants ruled as kings, clergy parroted sacred rites, and the world turned upside down. But what most observers miss is how these sanctioned rebellions ultimately reinforced the very structures they seemed to mock. The jester's temporary reign served as a pressure valve, allowing the steam of discontent to escape without ever threatening the foundations of power. This is the second great paradox. True subversion often strengthens what it appears to undermine. The wise jester understands this dynamic instinctively, recognizing that to overthrow the king, one must first become essential to the court's equilibrium. Alchemy provides perhaps the richest symbolic language for this transformation. The fool in the tarot, numbered 0, stands at the precipice of his journey, his gaze turned upward while unknowingly about to step off a cliff. This image captures the jester's dangerous wisdom, his apparent lack of direction masking an intuitive understanding of the currents of power. The alchemical process of solvet coagula, dissolution and reconstitution, mirrors the jester's path. First, he dissolves the certainties of the court through mockery, then reconstitutes them with himself at the center. The base metal of his foolishness becomes the gold of authority through the philosopher's stone of perception management. Shakespeare's fools, particularly the wise fools like King Lear's companion, demonstrate this transformation in action. They speak in riddles that contain uncomfortable truths, their apparent nonsense serving as a mirror to reflect the madness of those in power. When Lear's fool disappears from the play just as the king begins his descent into actual madness, we witness the symbolic transfer of wisdom from the sanctioned truth-teller to the crumbling monarch. The fool's absence becomes more powerful than his presence, a vacuum that draws all meaning toward it. This is the essence of the jester's strategy, to make himself so indispensable to the court's self-understanding that his eventual absence creates an existential crisis only he can resolve. Eastern traditions offer parallel insights. The Zen concept of the holy fool, the enlightened master who behaves erratically to shock students out of conventional thinking, shows how apparent irrationality can be the highest form of wisdom. In Chinese philosophy, the concept of wu wei, action through non-action, finds its perfect embodiment in the jester who rules by seeming not to rule. The Taoist sage Chuang's parable of the butcher whose knife never dulls because he cuts along the natural lines of the meat illustrates the jester's approach to power. He does not oppose structures directly, but finds the hidden seams where pressure can be most effectively applied. Modern psychology reveals another dimension through the concept of cognitive dissonance. The jester's humor creates a gap between what the court believes and what it experiences, a tension that demands resolution. When the jester transitions to power, he doesn't present himself as the solution to a crisis. He becomes the only imaginable resolution to the cognitive dissonance he himself has created. This psychological alchemy transforms laughter into loyalty, mockery into reverence. The court doesn't feel conquered. It feels relieved to have found someone who can make sense of the chaos. The most profound symbolic narrative may be the cosmic one. In many creation myths, the world emerges from divine laughter or playful chaos. The Hindu deity Shiva dances the universe into being even as he dances it out of existence. This cosmic play, Lila, reflects the jester's dual role as both creator and destroyer of realities. When the jester becomes king, he doesn't merely take power, he reshapes the very narrative fabric of the kingdom, becoming both author and protagonist in a story where his ascent appears inevitable. The court becomes his stage, the nobles his supporting cast, and history itself his playwright. The transition from jester to king is not confined to medieval courts or ancient myths. It unfolds daily in boardrooms, political campaigns, and digital landscapes where perception is the ultimate currency. To understand how these dynamics operate in our world, we must examine the subtle mechanics by which humor disarms, chaos reshapes hierarchies, and apparent foolishness becomes undeniable authority. The modern jester does not wear motley. He wears tailored suits or casual hoodies, speaks in viral tweets rather than courtly jests, and wields algorithms instead of a jingling scepter. Yet the principles remain unchanged. Consider the political strategist who adopts self-deprecating humor to deflect criticism while quietly consolidating influence. The technique is ancient: disarm through laughter, then redirect attention toward more calculated maneuvers. A leader who can laugh at himself becomes paradoxically harder to attack, his vulnerability transformed into strength. The moment his opponents attempt to critique him seriously, they appear humorless, out of touch, the very reaction he engineered. This is the jester's first practical law. Laughter neutralizes resistance before resistance can crystallize. The court jester mocked the king to his face and lived. The modern influencer does the same to institutions, brands, and rivals, eroding their gravitas while elevating his own relevance. Corporate environments reveal another dimension of this playbook. The employee who positions themselves as the office comedian often gains access to conversations and decisions from which more overtly ambitious colleagues are excluded. Why? Because humor creates trust, or at least, the illusion of it. The jester is perceived as harmless, even when his jokes carry barbs aimed at shifting power dynamics. Over time, his commentary shapes narratives, his jokes become insider wisdom, and his casual suggestions morph into company policy. This is the second practical law. Those who appear least threatening are granted the most access. The boardroom, like the royal court, is a stage, and the jester's greatest skill is ensuring he remains in every scene while never seeming like the lead, until suddenly, he is. Digital culture has amplified these dynamics exponentially. Social media clowns, those who build followings through absurdity, irony, or deliberate provocation, often transition from mockery to influence with startling speed. The pattern is recursive. They ridicule existing power structures, position themselves as outsiders, and then, once their audience is sufficiently conditioned, step into the vacuum they helped create. Memes become manifestos. Shitposts become slogans. The third practical law emerges here. Chaos is only valuable if you control its resolution. The troll who evolves into a thought leader does so by first dismantling the old frameworks of credibility, then offering himself as the only logical anchor in the storm. Even revolutionary movements follow this arc. The most effective disruptors are rarely the stern ideologues. They are the ones who wrap subversion in satire, making dissent palatable before making it potent. The jester's role in protest movements is often overlooked, yet it is critical. By framing resistance as humor, he expands its reach. By making power ridiculous, he makes it vulnerable. But the true masters of this game know that mockery alone is not enough. It must be followed by a new narrative, one in which the jester is no longer just the critic, but the natural successor. This is the fourth practical law. You cannot destroy a king without becoming the alternative. The dangers of this playbook are as real as its opportunities. A court that replaces a tyrant with a jester may find the new ruler's methods less overt but no less controlling. When humor becomes institutionalized, dissent can be dismissed as mere irreverence, criticism as a failure to take a joke. The Jester King's regime often masks its authority behind a veneer of populism, claiming to speak for the people while carefully filtering which voices are truly heard. This is the shadow side of the jester's ascent. The most effective authoritarianism is the kind that doesn't look like authoritarianism at all. For those who wish to navigate this landscape, whether to harness its strategies or resist its manipulations, the lessons are clear. First, recognize that humor is never just humor. It is a social solvent, capable of dissolving hierarchies or reinforcing them, depending on who wields it. Second, understand that the loudest voices are not always the most powerful. The jester's greatest moves are often the quietest. The shifts in tone, the carefully timed silence after a joke that lands too well. Third, be wary of those who demand you not take things so seriously. That phrase is often the first tool in undermining dissent. The call to transformation here is not merely about acquiring power, but about seeing through its illusions. The jester's ultimate lesson is that all authority is, to some degree, a collective act of imagination. To free oneself from undue influence, one must first recognize the mechanisms of that influence. The laughter that disarms, the chaos that distracts, the apparent humility that masks ambition. And perhaps, in that recognition, there is an opportunity to rewrite the script rather than merely recast the roles. This brings us to our final contemplation. The jester becomes king not because he is the strongest, but because he is the most adaptable. In a world where narratives are fragile and perception is fluid, the true power belongs to those who understand that the crown is never just a crown. It is a story waiting to be retold. There is a silence that lingers in the halls of power, a quietude that hums beneath the grand speeches and the polished smiles of kings. It is the silence of calculation, the unspoken arithmetic of rule, where every gesture is weighed, every word measured, and every smile, though it may seem warm, is a carefully placed stone in the architecture of control. To the peasant, toiling under the sun with calloused hands and a back bent by the seasons, the king's smile is a mystery, a flicker of light from a distant tower, untouchable and inscrutable. Why does he smile while the fields burn and the granaries empty? Why does his laughter echo through feasts while the people whisper of hunger? This is not merely a question of politics or economics, though it wears their masks. It is a question as old as civilization itself, as fundamental as the divide between the earth and the sky. The smile of the king is not an expression of joy but a tool, a weapon, a signal, sometimes to allies, sometimes to enemies, and often to the masses who must never see the gears turning behind a throne. Machiavelli, that sharp-eyed observer of human nature and power, understood this better than most. In his world, the prince, the ruler, must wear many faces, must be both lion and fox, must know when to bare his teeth and when to soften them into a grin. The smile is not weakness. It is strategy, but to the peasant, whose life is bound to the soil and the seasons, such smiles are either blessings or betrayals. The king's benevolence may be real, or it may be the velvet glove hiding the iron fist. The peasant suffers not because the king is cruel by nature, but because suffering is often the price of stability, the collateral of order. The ruler must sometimes choose between the illusion of kindness and the reality of control. And more often than not, control wins. Machiavelli would nod in recognition. The prince who wishes to keep his crown must sometimes let the people hunger so they do not grow bold, must sometimes let them struggle so they do not rise. Yet there is a deeper layer here, a cosmic irony that stretches beyond the machinations of men. The king smiles not because he is happy, but because he must. His throne is not a seat of comfort but a cage of expectations. The peasant may curse his own chains, but the king's chains are invisible, woven into the very fabric of his rule. To falter in his smile is to invite doubt. To show fear is to invite rebellion. The peasant suffers visibly, his pain etched into his body, his poverty written in the lines of his face. The king's suffering is hidden, folded into the weight of decisions that determine the fate of thousands. And so we arrive at the heart of the paradox. Power does not free a man from suffering. It merely changes its shape. The peasant's pain is raw and immediate. The ache of labor, the sting of want. The king's pain is the slow erosion of self. The knowledge that every choice is a gamble, every alliance a potential betrayal. He smiles because the alternative is chaos. He smiles because the world demands it. But let us not mistake this for justification. Machiavelli does not absolve the ruler of responsibility. He merely illuminates the brutal calculus of rule. The king's smile is not innocent. It is a calculated performance, a piece of theater in the grand drama of power. And the peasant's suffering? It is often the cost of admission, the price paid for the illusion of order. This is the world as it has always been. A world of masks and mirrors, where the powerful craft their own truths and the powerless navigate the shadows they cast. To ask why kings smile while peasants suffer is to ask why the sun shines on both the just and the unjust. The answer lies not in morality but in mechanics, not in fairness but in function. To understand why kings smile while peasants suffer, we must first dismantle the myth that power operates on the same moral axis as the lives of ordinary men. The ruler does not abide by the rules of the ruled. He exists beyond them, not by divine right, but by necessity, a necessity forged in the crucible of human nature itself. Machiavelli's great revelation was not that rulers are cruel, but that cruelty and kindness are merely instruments, levers pulled in service of something far colder, the preservation of power. The smile of the king is not an expression of joy but a signal, a carefully crafted illusion meant to project strength, benevolence, or indifference, whichever best serves the moment. At the core of this dynamic lies a fundamental asymmetry. The peasant's life is governed by immediacy, the need for bread, the fear of drought, the exhaustion of labor. His suffering is personal, visceral, a direct consequence of forces beyond his control. But the king's world is one of abstraction, of calculated moves and deferred consequences. His smile is not for the peasant. It is for the court, for the rivals watching from the shadows, for the historians who will one day write his name. The peasant sees only the surface, the feast, the procession, the golden robes, while the king navigates a labyrinth where every corridor hides a knife. Machiavelli's prince is neither good nor evil in the traditional sense. He is effective, and effectiveness in rulership often demands actions that would horrify the common man. A famine may be allowed to run its course if suppressing it would drain the treasury needed for war. A rebellion may be crushed with disproportionate force not because the king is bloodthirsty, but because mercy today invites greater chaos tomorrow. The smile, then, is a mask of stability, a way to reassure the people that all is well, even when it is not. To admit suffering would be to admit vulnerability, and vulnerability is the first crack in the foundation of power. Yet there is a deeper, almost tragic dimension to this. The king is as much a prisoner of his role as the peasant is of his. The peasant may curse his fate, but the king must never show doubt, for his doubt becomes the people's panic. The peasant may weep openly, but the king's grief must be swallowed, transformed into something useful. A speech, a decree, a strategic marriage. The weight of this performance is its own kind of suffering, a constant self-erasure in service of the crown. The smile is not a lie so much as a translation, the conversion of human frailty into the currency of rule. And what of the peasant? His suffering is not incidental but structural. A society built on hierarchy requires those at the bottom to bear its weight. The king does not smile because he is blind to this suffering, but because acknowledging it would unravel the fiction that justifies his rule. If the people believe their hardships are natural, inevitable, or even deserved, they are less likely to revolt. But if they see that their suffering is the direct result of choices made in marble halls, the entire edifice trembles. Thus, the king's smile is also a distraction, a way to keep eyes turned upward in or rather than inward in question. This is where Machiavelli's realism becomes almost poetic in its ruthlessness. He does not ask whether it is right for kings to smile while peasants suffer. He asks what would happen if they did not. A grin-faced ruler invites speculation. Is he weak? Is he guilty? Is he losing control? The smile is a performance of invincibility, a way to project order even when chaos gnaws at the edges. The peasant's suffering, in this sense, is not just tolerated but sometimes subtly encouraged, because a people who are hungry are easier to control than a people who are fed and restless. A man who must beg for bread is unlikely to demand rights. But let us not reduce this to mere cynicism. There is a terrible logic here, one that transcends individual rulers and speaks to the nature of power itself. The king is not free. He is bound by the same forces that bind the peasant: fear, necessity, the unrelenting pressure of survival. But his chains are made of gold rather than iron. His smile is his shackle. The peasant's suffering is his. Power does not exist in the open. It thrives in the half-light, in the unspoken understandings between those who rule and those who obey. To grasp why kings smile while peasants suffer, we must step beyond the realm of policy and into the realm of myth, where truths are not spoken but enacted, where history repeats not as fact but as parable. Consider the ancient story of the Fisher King, ruler of a wasteland, his body wounded in a way that mirrors the decay of his kingdom. He sits enthroned in splendor, yet the land withers, the people starve, and no one can say why. The king does not weep, he presides. His smile is not joy but ritual, the performance of sovereignty even as the roots of the realm rot beneath him. This is the first great illusion of power, that the ruler and the ruled inhabit the same world. They do not. The peasant lives in the world of flesh, of aching muscles and empty stomachs, of children buried in droughts and winters that outlast the firewood. The king lives in the world of symbols, where a raised hand can mean war or pardon, where a feast can signal prosperity even as the granary's empty. His smile is part of this theater, a carefully staged act to convince the audience, the people, the nobles, the spies of rival courts, that the story is still under his control. Machiavelli understood this instinctively. The prince, he wrote, must be a master of appearances, for it is appearances that hold the mob in check. A king who lets his mask slip is a king who invites the dagger. There is an older tale still, whispered in the dialects of forgotten empires. The tale of the scorpion and the frog. The frog carries the scorpion across the river, knowing the scorpion's nature, trusting its promise not to sting. Midway, the sting comes, and as they both sink, the scorpion shrugs. I could not help it. It is my nature. The king is the scorpion. His smile is not a betrayal of his nature, but an expression of it. To expect him to rule otherwise is to expect the river to flow backward. The peasant, like the frog, knows the risk, but what choice does he have? He must believe, if only to make the weight of his yoke bearable. Yet there is another layer here, one that Machiavelli himself might have appreciated. The king is also the frog. He, too, is bound by the nature of power, which demands that he play his role or be swept aside. A ruler who truly grieves for his people's suffering is a ruler who will not last. For grief is a luxury that power cannot afford. The smile is his defense, his way of saying, I am still here, still unbroken, still in command. The tragedy is not that he deceives the people, but that he must deceive himself first. And then there is the most potent symbol of all, the crown itself. It is not merely an object but a living idea, heavy with the ghosts of every ruler who ever wore it. The peasant looks up and sees gold. The king feels its weight and knows it is lined with thorns. To wear the crown is to accept a pact. You may wield power, but power will also wield you. The smile is part of the price. A grimacing king is a failing king. A weeping king is a dead king. The peasants suffer, yes, but the king suffers too, not in his body, but in his soul, which must harden or shatter. These stories are not mere fables. They are the subconscious grammar of power, the unspoken rules that even the most ruthless rulers obey without realizing it. The king smiles because the story demands it. The peasant suffers because the story requires it. To change the ending, one must first change the narrative. And that is a feat no single ruler, no single people, has ever managed for long. The distance between a king's smile and a peasant's suffering may seem like the stuff of history books, a relic of feudal courts and Renaissance intrigues. But the mechanisms Machiavelli exposed are not confined to palaces. They pulse through boardrooms, governments, and even our daily interactions. Power wears modern suits instead of crowns, yet its essence remains unchanged. It rewards those who master its illusions and crushes those who mistake its performance for reality. To understand this is to arm oneself against the subtle tyrannies that shape our world. Consider the corporate executive who announces layoffs with a serene grin, praising the resilience of the team while severing livelihoods. His smile is not a betrayal of his role, but its purest expression. Like Machiavelli's prince, he knows that admitting doubt would undermine authority, that showing hesitation would invite chaos. The employees, today's peasants, are left to parse the dissonance. How can the hand that fires them also pat their shoulders with paternal warmth? The answer lies in the division of worlds. The executive inhabits a realm where numbers justify sacrifices, where shareholder value absolves human cost. His smile is the modern crown's glint, designed to signal control even as the foundation shakes. This pattern repeats in politics. A leader facing scandal doesn't confess. He smiles, pivots, reframes. The more severe the crisis, the broader the grin, for the alternative is to concede vulnerability. Machiavelli's lesson here is clinical. The moment a ruler's mask slips, vultures circle. Modern media amplifies this dynamic exponentially. A single grimace can spiral into trending hashtags. A sigh can birth conspiracy theories. Thus, leaders are trained to perform like kings of old, their emotions meticulously curated by teams of handlers. The public, meanwhile, navigates a storm of manufactured sincerity, left to wonder why policies that boost the economy leave them choosing between rent and groceries. The suffering is real. The smiles are strategic. But the most insidious application of this principle lives in our personal hierarchies. Every social group has its micro-kings. The charismatic friend who dictates plans without consultation. The family patriarch whose jokes mask control. The influencer who moneizes relatability while living in unattainable luxury. These are not villains. They are simply players of the game, leveraging Machiavelli's timeless insight that affection and fear are two sides of the same coin. The difference between ancient kingdoms and modern friendships is one of scale, not substance. The smile that disarms a peasant also disarms a co-worker. The unspoken rule that one does not challenge the king becomes "don't rock the boat." So how does one resist? The first step is to see the machinery behind the mask. When a leader's grin doesn't reach their eyes, when a corporation's "we're all family" rhetoric accompanies wage cuts, recognize these not as hypocrisies but as proof of power's consistency. The second step is to reject the lie that suffering is inevitable. Kings rely on resignation, the belief that this is just how things are. But history's greatest disruptions came when peasants stopped accepting their role in the story. Unions, protests, and collective bargaining are the modern equivalent of storming the palace gates. They force the smiling king to negotiate with reality. The final step is the most radical: to refuse to wear the crown in your own sphere. Every person holds fragments of power over employees, children, social circles, and faces the same choice as Renaissance princes. Wield it with awareness or perpetuate the cycle. Will you be the parent who demands obedience through fear, or the one who leads with transparency? The manager who hides behind corporate jargon, or the one who acknowledges hard truths? Machiavelli might argue that the former is safer, but safety isn't justice. The king's smile and the peasant's suffering are not opposites. They are collaborators in a dance as old as civilization. One cannot exist without the other, for power requires contrast. Light needs shadow to be seen. But this dance is not immutable. It persists only because we mistake its steps for natural law, because we bow to crowns we've been taught to see as ordained rather than crafted. The transformational question is this: will you live as a subject in someone else's story, or will you rewrite the narrative? To choose the latter is to recognize that every hierarchy is upheld by collective belief. The king's authority vanishes the moment peasants stop kneeling. The CEO's power evaporates when workers walk out. This isn't idealism, it's the coldest realism, proven by every revolution in history. Machiavelli's true gift was not his defense of ruthlessness, but his exposure of power's inner workings. He showed us the gears so we might learn to stop them. The call, then, is not to vilify the kings of the world, but to outgrow our need for them. To build systems where no one's survival depends on another's performance of benevolence. Where smiles are not tools but truths. The choice is yours. Will you keep watching the stage, or will you tear it down? Have you ever witnessed a leader so breathtakingly inept that their very presence in power feels like a cosmic joke at humanity's expense? Not just an ordinary incompetent, but someone whose every decision makes you question whether the universe itself is mocking us. A ruler so perfectly mismatched to their position that their ascendance defies all logic, all reason, all common sense. What you're seeing is no accident of history, but rather the inevitable outcome of a system where power doesn't filter for excellence. It filters for the absence of conscience. The great unspoken truth of civilization is this: competence is a handicap in the pursuit of power. The qualities that actually make someone good at governing, wisdom, foresight, ethical restraint, are the very traits that disqualify them from winning the vicious tournament of leadership. Meanwhile, the reckless, the narcissistic, the morally unburdened surge ahead precisely because they lack the inhibitions that would slow a better person down. It's not that good people can't gain power. It's that the system is chemically engineered to repel them. Machiavelli saw this with crystalline clarity 500 years ago when he observed that to understand how power really works, one must study what is done rather than what ought to be done. His infamous treatise was less a prescription than an autopsy, cutting open the corpse of political reality to reveal the maggots of human nature feasting within. The uncomfortable truth he exposed remains unchanged today. The game is rigged in favor of those willing to cheat, not because evil always triumphs, but because the rules of power systematically eliminate anyone unwilling to play dirty. Consider the brutal efficiency of this mechanism. While the wise hesitate, weighing consequences, considering ethics, paralyzed by nuance, the fools charge ahead armed with nothing but audacity and a complete lack of self-awareness. Their very incompetence becomes their greatest asset in a world that rewards the appearance of confidence over actual capability. We've built societies that mistake swagger for strength, volume for validity, and stubbornness for wisdom. The result? A leadership class perfectly optimized for failure. This phenomenon transcends politics. It's encoded in the DNA of every human hierarchy. In corporations, the psychopath rises while the team player stagnates. In academia, the shameless self-promoter lands tenure while the careful researcher toils in obscurity. Even in families, the most demanding child commands the most attention. The system isn't broken, it's functioning exactly as designed, rewarding precisely the behaviors we claim to despise. What makes this more than just a cynical observation is the terrifying implication. We keep getting the leaders we deserve, not because we're unlucky, but because we're predictable. Our psychological wiring makes us lap up simple solutions to complex problems. Our social structures reward performative masculinity over quiet competence. Our institutions value the illusion of control more than actual governance. Until we confront why this keeps happening, why Machiavelli's observations remain as true in Silicon Valley as they were in Renaissance Florence, we remain trapped in what might be called the idiot's paradox. The dumber our leaders act, the more we trust their apparent confidence. The mechanisms that elevate fools to power operate with the ruthless precision of physical laws, governing human hierarchies as predictably as gravity governs falling objects. At the heart of this phenomenon lie three immutable principles that Machiavelli glimpsed through the fog of Renaissance politics, and which modern behavioral science has since confirmed with clinical precision. These are not mere observations about bad leadership, but fundamental rules about how power actually distributes itself in human systems, regardless of era or culture. The first law states that the likelihood of gaining power is inversely proportional to one's scruples. This is the brutal mathematics of dominance hierarchies. Every ethical constraint, every moral hesitation, every moment spent considering collateral damage represents friction in the machinery of ambition. The sociopath who views others as stepping stones will always outpace the conscientious leader who sees them as human beings. This explains why corporate psychopaths are 4 times more likely to reach executive positions than their empathetic peers, and why political systems consistently filter for what psychologists call dark triad traits: narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. The system isn't malfunctioning when it produces such leaders. It's working exactly as designed. The second law reveals that competence creates friction where foolishness flows freely. Actual capability requires time, effort, and often unpopular decisions, all of which slow one's ascent. Meanwhile, the fool's complete lack of substantive knowledge becomes an unexpected asset, allowing them to pivot without cognitive dissonance, to promise impossibilities without hesitation, to project confidence untroubled by actual understanding. Modern neuroscience confirms this perverse advantage. The Dunning-Kruger effect ensures that the least competent are often the most confident, while true experts are paralyzed by the knowledge of what they don't know. In a world where perception trumps reality, this creates a perfect storm where the empty vessel makes the most noise. The third law, most devastating of all, demonstrates that systems naturally evolve to reward system gaming. Like a virus adapting to its host, ambitious fools inevitably discover and exploit the most efficient paths to power within any given hierarchy. This explains why different eras produce different flavors of incompetence. The medieval court jester becomes the modern talking head. The hereditary aristocrat becomes the legacy admission. But the underlying dynamics remain unchanged. Organizational theorists call this the iron law of oligarchy. All systems, no matter how idealistically conceived, eventually become optimized for seizing and retaining power rather than achieving their stated goals. The fools aren't breaking the system. They're simply its most perfect users. These 3 laws conspire to create what might be called the leadership paradox. The better someone would actually be at leading, the less likely they are to gain power in the first place. The wise are disqualified by their wisdom, the competent by their competence, the ethical by their ethics. Meanwhile, the system positively selects for the worst possible candidates, creating a perverse evolutionary pressure where each generation of leaders is more perfectly adapted to gaining power and less equipped to wield it responsibly. This explains why history appears as one long procession of blundering elites. It's not that humanity has bad luck with leaders, but that we've created systems where only bad leaders can succeed. The Roman emperors knew it. The Medici bankers perfected it. And today's corporate climbers and political operatives prove it anew each day. The tragedy isn't that fools occasionally stumble into power. It's that our systems make their ascendance mathematically inevitable. The archetype of the foolish ruler is not merely a modern frustration or a Renaissance observation. It is a thread woven deep into humanity's oldest stories, appearing again and again as if the collective unconscious has been trying to warn us for millennia. Consider the Tarot's fool, that carefree wanderer stepping blithely off a cliff, oblivious to the abyss below. He is not just a figure of comedy, but of prophecy, a representation of how power often falls to those too reckless to fear the fall. In mythology, we see the same pattern. The buffoonish kings of folklore, the trickster gods who stumble into dominion, the jesters who whisper uncomfortable truths while the wise rulers make disastrous decisions. These stories endure because they resonate with the truth we recognize but struggle to articulate. The world is not led by the wise, but by those best able to perform wisdom while evading its burdens. Take the ancient parable of the emperor's new clothes. The tale is often remembered as a lesson about childish honesty, but its deeper subtext is far more cynical. The swindlers who sell the invisible fabric are not the villains of the story. They are its realists, understanding that power is sustained by collective pretense. The courtiers who claim to see the non-existent robes are not cowards, but skilled players in a game where perception is everything. And the emperor himself. He is neither a fool nor a victim, but the perfect embodiment of leadership's central paradox. Those in charge often know least of all, yet depend entirely on others' willingness to pretend otherwise. The child who declares the truth is not celebrated but silenced, for the system cannot tolerate the revelation that its authority is naked. History offers its own grim pantheon of fools-turned-rulers. Caligula, who made his horse a senator, was not an aberration but an extreme example of a recurring type. The leader whose very absurdity becomes a perverse proof of their power. What does it say about authority when madness not only fails to disqualify one from wielding it, but can even strengthen one's grip? The answer lies in the unsettling reality that power is not about competence, but about the suspension of disbelief. The more outrageous the leader, the more their followers must contort their own judgment to justify loyalty, creating a feedback loop of devotion. This explains why cults of personalities so often form around the least substantial figures. The greater the gap between the leader's merits and their status, the more energy the system must expend to maintain the illusion, binding followers ever tighter to the collective fiction. Even religion and philosophy echo this theme. In Christianity, Paul writes that God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise, a line that reads less like divine praise and more like bitter observation. Zen Buddhism's foolish wise man archetype, the one who appears simple but sees clearly, suggests that true understanding requires shedding the pretenses that power demands. Meanwhile, Nietzsche's madman announcing the death of God is not a prophet but a fool, the only figure free enough from societal constraints to voice what others dare not admit. These traditions converge on the same uncomfortable truth. The fool is often the only one permitted to speak truth to power, precisely because power dismisses them as harmless. But what happens when the fool ceases to be the court jester and becomes the king? Modernity has not escaped this dynamic. It has simply dressed it in new costumes. The celebrity CEO who rockets to fame despite a trail of wreckage. The politician whose gaffes only endear them to supporters. The influencer who moneizes ignorance. All are heirs to the same ancient pattern. Social media has merely amplified the fool's advantage, creating a world where the loudest, brashest, and least substantive voices dominate simply because they best exploit the medium's addictive rhythms. The algorithm does not reward wisdom. It rewards engagement. And nothing engages like folly dressed as revelation. The through line is unmistakable. Civilization's most enduring stories keep returning to the fool in power not because we find it entertaining, but because we know it to be true. The question is not why this keeps happening, but why we keep pretending it shouldn't. Perhaps because to admit otherwise would force us to confront an even more terrifying possibility, that the fool doesn't corrupt the system, but is its purest product. The recognition that folly so often wears the crown presents us with a formidable challenge. How does one navigate a world where the rules of power seem deliberately designed to frustrate wisdom? This is not an academic question but a survival skill. For the systems we inhabit, from corporate ladders to political structures, all operate according to these ancient, unspoken laws. The first step is radical clarity. We must stop pretending these dynamics don't exist or hoping that merit will eventually triumph. History shows it rarely does unless consciously engineered to do so. The solution lies not in becoming fools ourselves, but in developing what might be called strategic integrity, the ability to maintain one's principles while understanding exactly how and when the system will punish them. Consider the workplace, that microcosm of power dynamics where the fool's advantage manifests daily. Research shows that narcissists are significantly more likely to be promoted than their more competent peers, not because they produce better results, but because they're better at claiming credit and shifting blame. The employee who quietly solves problems goes unnoticed while the one who loudly takes credit for others' work rises. This isn't an anomaly. It's the system working as designed. The wise response isn't to emulate this behavior, but to recognize that visibility is often more valuable than virtue in such environments. This doesn't require compromising ethics, but rather understanding that good work must be paired with strategic communication. Not because this is how it should be, but because this is how the game is played. The political arena offers even starker lessons. Studies of electoral outcomes consistently demonstrate that voters prefer confident candidates over competent ones, even when that confidence is completely unwarranted. The implications are terrifying. Democratic systems, theoretically designed to produce the best leaders, often function as perfect machines for selecting the most charismatic fools. This explains the rise of so-called political outsiders who leverage their very lack of experience as proof of their authenticity. The antidote isn't abandoning democracy, but reforming its structures to reduce the advantage of pure performative politics. Perhaps through sortition, random selection of leaders, more robust technocratic checks, or electoral systems that reward consensus building over grandstanding. On a personal level, this understanding should fundamentally alter how we interact with power structures. The key insight is that most hierarchies operate on two parallel sets of rules: the official ones stated in handbooks and manifestos, and the real ones governing actual advancement. The wise individual learns to navigate both without becoming corrupted by the latter. This might mean developing what the ancient Greeks called metis, practical cunning, not to exploit others but to avoid being exploited. It means recognizing when to speak truth to power, rarely, when to keep one's head down, often, and when to exit a corrupt system entirely, sooner than we'd like to admit. The most profound implication, however, is collective rather than individual. If we understand that systems naturally degrade toward folly unless actively prevented from doing so, we must design institutions with this in mind. This means building organizations where transparency makes grandstanding harder, where checks and balances prevent any one fool from causing too much damage, where incentives reward actual results rather than mere performance. The solution to bad leadership isn't better followers, it's better systems. We must create structures where the path to power requires demonstrating actual competence rather than just gaming perceptions, where ethical behavior is rewarded rather than punished, where the costs of foolishness are borne by the foolish rather than by their subordinates. The uncomfortable truth we must finally confront is that fools don't rise despite our systems. They rise because of them. For too long, we've treated this as some inevitable law of nature when in reality it's the product of human decisions, human designs, human cowardice. Machiavelli's real lesson wasn't that this is how power works. It's that this is how we've chosen to let power work. The transformational call, then, is not to lament this state of affairs but to become architects of better systems. This begins with ruthless self-honesty about our own complicity. Every time we applaud style over substance, every time we excuse bad behavior because that's just how the game is played, every time we stay silent in the face of obvious folly, we place another brick in the fool's throne. The change starts by valuing what actually matters, not the confident answer but the correct one, not the flashy solution but the effective one, not the charismatic leader but the competent one. The good news is that systems can be redesigned, and history shows brief golden ages where wisdom prevailed, usually when societies consciously structured themselves to make folly less rewarding. We stand at a point where we can choose to continue the ancient cycle of foolish rulers and suffering masses, or we can finally build institutions that resist rather than enable this dynamic. The tools are all around us, from technology that enables unprecedented transparency, to psychological insights that help us design better decision-making structures, to historical examples of what actually works. The choice is ours. Will we remain passive observers to the endless parade of fools? Or will we become the generation that finally breaks this ancient curse? The throne awaits, but this time, it could be occupied by wisdom rather than folly. All that's required is the courage to make it so.